So the purpose of the respiratory system is to move air in and out of the lungs, to exchange oxygen and carbon dioxide in the lungs, transport oxygen and carbon dioxide in the blood, and then exchange oxygen and CO2 in the tissues from the blood. So air moves initially into the mouth and into the nose and into the back of the throat. The back of the throat is called the pharynx. Air gets hydrated in the nasal sinuses, and hydration of air is critical to be able to diffuse oxygen across the tissue in the lungs. During a fire, drying out the air, although it also removes the oxygen, dries out the lungs, and the lungs cannot exchange oxygen in the tissues. In the back of the throat, we have the pharynx. We have the nasopharynx, which is the highest portion of the back of the throat. The oral pharynx, the middle portion, what's called the laryngeal pharynx, where the voice box is going to be. So the throat then ends where the trachea goes down one direction in the front, and the food tube or the esophagus goes down behind. Here we see the nasal cavities and the oral cavities coming back to the back of the throat. Here is the esophagus, and going in this way would be the trachea, but it is covered by a flap to prevent a bolus of food from going down the wrong direction. The opening of the top of the trachea is called the glottis, Glottis. The flap that covers the opening is called the epiglottis. So when you swallow fluid, the epiglottis is closed over the glottal opening. When you are breathing, the epiglottis opens, allowing air to go down into the trachea. Now, in the opening of the glottis, you have folds of tissue that vibrate when air is exhaled. This area is called the larynx or the voice box. You have tissue on the top and tissue towards the bottom. The top are called false vocal cords, hence falsetto, and the bottom are the true vocal cords. So we see here the trachea, and you notice that the trachea has these rings, and these rings are called tracheal rings. They go approximately 3/4 the way around the trachea. The job of the tracheal rings are to prevent the trachea from collapsing during inhalation and exhalation, just the way a straw can collapse when you're trying to suck thick milkshake out of the straw. The straw collapses, but if you have a very thick walled straw, it will not. So this thickens and stabilizes the wall of the trachea. They are called tracheal rings. The trachea divides or bifurcates into a left and right bronchus. So this is called the main bronchus. Then we have secondary bronchi, in other words, they branch off. And then we have what's called tertiary. We branch off again. So primary, secondary, tertiary. Then as they get smaller, we call those branches bronchioles. And the bronchioles become the alveolar ducts. And then we have a structure called the alveolus. So air is carried all the way down the trachea into the right and left primary bronchi, secondary and tertiary bronchi to bronchioles, into the alveolar duct and into the alveolus. Again, here we see the alveoli that are like a sack of grapes. So we see the alveolar duct going into the alveoli, and the alveoli are actually one cell layer thick, and they are going to fill up with air, and oxygen is going to diffuse across the membrane. The capillary beds line around the alveoli to absorb the oxygen, and have carbon dioxide diffuse back over the membrane into the air. Here we see deoxygenated blood coming around, picking up oxygen, and then going as the pulmonary vein back to the lungs. So air comes in, oxygen diffuses across the membrane, carbon dioxide diffuses back into the alveolar sac and back out. This happens with each breathing cycle. Air is mostly nitrogen. Nitrogen helps keep the sac open. So breathing pure oxygen can actually collapse your lungs over a period of time. But we also have a chemical called surfactant layer that is essentially a bubble. It is a bubble of soap, and this soap bubble keeps the alveolus open. Now, babies begin to secrete surfactant in their lungs before they were born, approximately 6 or 8 weeks before they are born. Preemies, who are born premature, before 8 weeks often cannot breathe on their own because they do not have a surfactant layer yet. As they develop a surfactant layer, they will be taken off the ventilator. The lungs are able to draw air into the alveoli because the diaphragm at the bottom of the lungs, from the spine and to the ribs, will contract and flatten out and pull the lungs down. This is exhalation. You have a very dome-shaped diaphragm, but on inhalation, the diaphragm contracts. This dome flattens out, and it pulls the lungs down on each breath. This is called diaphragmatic breathing. We also have accessory muscles of respiration, muscles that can pull the ribs up and out. You do not want to breathe with these muscles all the time. They will wear you out. But deep breathing and exercise often uses our accessory muscles of respiration, our intercostal muscles, our neck muscles called the scalenes and sternocleidomastoids, and then your internal and external oblique muscles. All of these are capable of opening up the ribs, as well as the diaphragm pulling the lungs down.